Shall we start? Rachir sir, can you please start?
Sorry.
Yeah, Miss Aishwarya, I'm ready.
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I'm ready. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Aishwarya from Alpha Crown Technologies. I'll be the tech support for this session. I would like to go through a few points to adapt for a smooth and glitch-free webinar session. Please note, except for the video of panel speakers, co-host, other participants' videos will be switched off and the mic will be kept in mute. Participants will not be able to unmute yourself. Request all the participants to choose the speaker view found in the top right-hand corner of your screen. To ask questions to the speaker, please use chat box found in the bottom of your screen. For those participants logged using tab or mobile phone, the chat box is found under the More button. The host team will read the questions to the speaker on your behalf. If you need any assistance, please reach me by sending a message in the chat box or use the raise hand option found in the bottom of the screen under the participants button. For participants' kind information, this session is being recorded for official purposes. Yes, ma'am. We are also going live in YouTube. The link is posted in the chat box. I welcome Mrs. Vasumati. Ma'am, can you please sing an invocation song to start the session?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Aishwarya, and thank you, Mr. Soranachya Rajashekar, for inviting us for this program. I'll start with an invocation. கலினாளுக்கிறங்கி கல்லிலே இறங்கி சிலையாக கோவிலில் நிற்கின்றாய் கேசவா கலினாளுக்கிறங்கி கல்லிலே இறங்கி இலையாக கோவிலில் நிற்கின்றாய் கேசவா குறையொன்றும் இல்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா யாதும் மறுக்காத மலையப்பா யாதும் மறுக்காத மலையப்பா உன் மார்பில் ஏதும் தர நிற்கும் கருணை கடல் அன்னை என்றும் இருந்திட ஏது குறை நமக்கு ஒன்றும் குறையில்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா ஒன்றும் குறையில்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா மணிவண்ணா மலையப்பா கோவிந்தா கோவிந்தா. Let's sing the blessings of Almighty for a safe world.
Thank you, ma'am. I request the President, Mr. Rajashekar, to welcome the gathering.
Welcome to everybody. On behalf of the Tamil Chamber of Commerce, I welcome the chief guest, Thiru Shankar Aiyar, former Panchayati Minister, former MP of Mayiladurai, Cholamandalam, and all our members, committee members, executive committee members, and office bearers, sister chamber members, and some registered through overseas from Dubai, Jakarta in Indonesia, and the other countries, especially a registration from Pakistan came after seeing that our chief guest address where he on at Lahore. A registration is also made from Pakistan also. Apart from Myanmar, Singapore, Malaysian countries also participated in this Zoom meeting. I welcome all others who are registered and who are also going to join in few minutes. They are entering every second, so few people entering. And I once again thank you for Mr. Marimuthu for arranging this chief guest address for our Zoom meeting. It's one of the chamber existing in Chennai. One of the oldest chambers started in the year 1944, and recently we celebrated Platinum Jubilee, for which our Vice President of India came and addressed our members and distributed the PCC Soranachya Foundation Exim Awards to the awardees of exporters who have done appreciately in exports through Chennai ports and airports. Now coming to this Zoom meeting, this is the 128th birthday of R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar. Today is his 138th birthday. In memory of his birthday, the chamber is organizing a memorial lecture. The theme of the title of this meeting is Indian Economy, Past, Present and Future, which is relevant today scenario. And the person who is going to address this title is also very relevant and authentic economic experts. And our chief guest, during his regime only the Panchayati Raj bill passed. Today, every Panchayat leaders and villages enjoying the benefits of the Panchayati Raj passed in his regime. Mahatma Gandhi told that our soul is in villages, India, proving this concept. Thiru Shankar Aiyar during his Rajiv Gandhi political career and his work in the Congress cabinet later, he bring that Panchayati Raj bill, which benefited all over the India. And later, due to that bill only, the other women participation in Panchayati Raj, everything is happened. So we have to appreciate the efforts of our chief guest and to recognize his achievements. R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar finished his school in Coimbatore Union School and college at Madras Christian College and Chennai Law College. At the time of independence, Mahatma Gandhi referred him to become first finance minister in the Nehru government, Jawaharlal Nehru government. The former Governor General of India, Thiru Rajaji, the great statesman, convinced Thiru RKS to become the first finance minister. He only drafted the first 3 budgets of India. There is an interesting anecdote behind this. When Mahatma Gandhi toured over Tamil Nadu state, Mr. R.K. Shanmugam associated with the tour and he is all along organized that trip. Apart from that, Mahatma Gandhi stayed at his home at Coimbatore. At the time of leaving the Coimbatore, Mr. R.K. Shanmugam recorded a signature in his autobiography book from Mahatma Gandhi. Then Mahatma Gandhi asked him if he give a promise to hand spin the Kaitari Ratela Nool Nurkana daily 1 mani nera for 1 hour daily. If you give that promise, I will sign autograph. Immediately, without hesitation, RKS replied that it is not possible. I don't have experience, I don't have time and interest in that. Inspired his genuine and honest, he immediately signed without asking anything. That is the anecdote everybody used to tell. Then R.K. Shanmugam contributed in many fields: economy, social, administration, Tamil, language, music, literature, politics, trade and industry. Through chambers of commerce, he contributed so many things. In the year 1929, he participated in the International Labour Conference, and in 1935, he attended Geneva International Conference representing India. In the year 1944, he participated in the Bretton Woods Conference in USA representing India. The deliberations of that conference only leads to the formation of IMF, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, 2 important international organizations. He was also the member of and deputy leader of Coimbatore Corporation in those days. And he was also a whip in the Central Legislative Assembly and Speaker of Indian National Assembly. He was the first Tamil speaker in Parliament in those days. From 1931 to 1945, he held the post of Diwan of Cochin. He made several administrative reforms and established Cochin Government Secretariat and Cochin High Court. Even today, even though Trivandrum is the capital of Kerala, the chief High Court is situated only in Cochin. He participated in the debates and argued for state right always in parliament debates. And he opposed the concentration of powers and authorities in the central government. மாநில அதிகாரங்களுக்காக குரல் கொடுத்து மத்தியில் அதிகாரங்களை குவித்து வைப்பதை எதிர்த்து குரல் கொடுத்தவர். அதிகார பரவலின் மூலம் தான் நம்ம our own chief guest now, who is going to address you also in the similar wavelength, giving power to the grassroots level of Panchayati Raj. In the year 1943, he was the leader of Standing Committee of Industry. Under his recommendations, 32 national scientific and industrial research centers formed all over India. In the year 1950, he was the chairman of Chennai Industrial Investment Corporation. Now it is called TIC, I think. And also held the post of Executive Director of National Newsprint Limited, which is now Tamil Nadu Newsprint Limited, I think. He served as a Vice Chancellor of Annamalai University and was very punctual in attending the university meeting. He will come to the right time, exactly, punctually, without coming late or earlier. Exact time. Even now, our chief guest, he sent an email yesterday stating that I will be joining by 5:20. Today, 5:20 is on the. That is the similarities I found as well as in our RKS and Shankar Aiyar sir. During his tenure as a VC of Annamalai University, he formed a committee with K.P. Sethu Pillai, E.V. Jagannathan and Avai Doraisamy for publishing Kamba Ramayanam, which was very famous and authentic to read and referred by many. And also during his tenure as a finance minister, he provided fund for creating Tamil Kalanjiyam. And he himself wrote Silappadigaram Urai in simple Tamil for understanding. During his tenure as finance minister at the time of independence, the most significant achievement from. At the time of partition in 1947, we have large debts due to this participation of Second World War. Actually, the Indians are not interested to participate. By force, the British government made this war. When we got independence, we have to repay the debts. Thiru R.K. Shanmugam went to London and argued that we are not interested to participate in the war. It is forced without our approval. So the destruction cost due to this participation of Second World War should be borne by the British government. That is his greatest achievement. Otherwise, we will be in a debt trap at that time. RK's knowledge, experts in both Tamil and English, and public relationship from common people to elite people, British, even up to British viceroys, leads to the foundation for all his achievements. He served for his home state, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, South India, all over the country as a finance minister, and the international organizations like IMF and World Bank formation, etc. Because of these qualities only. His service in many fields remain as icon, representing his place in Tamil Nadu and served as a country, India as a country in politics, social, cultural and political life, social upgradation of inclusive growth, etc. The Tamil Chamber of Commerce recognize his achievements and keep his memory on his birthday. And I request Thiru Shankar Aiyar, the former Minister of Panchayati Raj, and he also had a portfolio of petroleum, natural gas, youth affairs, etc. With his valuable address. Before that, formerly, the chief guest will be introduced by Mrs. Marimuthu. Thank you.
Good. Can I, Aishwarya? Yeah. Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very happy to introduce Mr. Shankar Aiyar, who is a friend of our family for more than 30 years. And more than that, he is the pride of South, who had been a source of great inspiration, a great orator with the fingertip economics and analytical details. Very, very happy to introduce you, sir. Mr. Shankar Aiyar, born on April 10th, 1941, Lahore, India, now Pakistan, Indian diplomat, politician, and government official who, after a distinguished foreign service career, became a senior leader in the Indian National Congress. Aiyar's family migrated to India from a newly formed Pakistan following the partition of British India in 1947. His father died while he was still young, and he attended the prestigious Doon School at Dehradun, where he got the acquaintance of late Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Mr. Aiyar went on to earn 2 degrees in economics, one at the University of Delhi in 1961 and the second at the University of Cambridge in 1963. In 1963, Mr. Aiyar entered the Indian Foreign Service, and over the next 15 years, he served at various overseas diplomatic postings, including Belgium and Iraq. In 78, following a warm-up in relations between India and Pakistan, he was named India's first Consul General to that country, occupying the Deputy High Commission in Karachi. He remained there until 1982, at which time he returned to New Delhi to serve for the next year as a joint secretary in the national government's Ministry of External Affairs. The final portion of this foreign service career, 1985 to 89, was also spent in New Delhi, where he was assigned to the office of the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Mr. Aiyar decided to retire from the Foreign Service in 1989 to pursue a career in politics. A member of the Congress Party, he served as a special assistant to Rajiv Gandhi, who was then president of the party until Rajiv Gandhi's assassination in 1991. His proximity to Gandhi family shaped much of his subsequent political career. Mr. Aiyar first ran for elected office in 1991, where he won a seat in Lok Sabha from a constituency called Mayiladurai in Tamil Nadu. He was re-elected to it 2 more times at 1999 and 2004. He made Mayiladurai a evergreen piece of land with complete transformation in terms of all infrastructures. He was re-elected to it 2 more times, and he joined the cabinet of the newly formed Congress-led United Progressive Alliance coalition government, where until 2009, he was the head of the Panchayati Raj, the ministry overseeing India's system of Panchayat. During his tenure in the UPA government, Mr. Aiyar also held the portfolios of Ministries of Petroleum and Natural Gas from 2004 to 6, Youth Affairs and Sports between 2006 and 8, and Development of Northeastern Region 2008 and 9. The highlight is he brought complete rehabilitation to the Northeastern people. Today, we have sincere workers from Northeast working in different parts of the country, including Tamil Nadu, thanks to the one and only effort of Shri Shankar Aiyar. He was honored as the outstanding parliamentarian by the President of India. Put your hands together, and I'm very, very happy to welcome Shri Shankar Aiyar here to this prestigious Tamil Chamber of Commerce.
Welcome, sir. Please.
அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். நம்ம பிரசிடென்ட் திரு சோழ நாச்சியார் ராஜசேகர் அவர்களே, and my friends Thiru and Tirumati Marimuthu, as also others who have greeted me, including Thiru Aruloli avargal and Thiru Majid avargal, as well as Thiru Chandrasekhar P avargal. அனைவருக்கும் நன்றி, அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். I have been requested to speak in English, and I'm very grateful for that, because my English is certainly superior to my Tamil. Yet I felt that since I am one of you, it would be appropriate to say a few words right at the start, which were in Tamil. I find this to be a very strange invitation because I am an unreconstructed Nehruvian and an unreconstructed socialist, and I am not at all sure that Mr. R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar would have wanted me to deliver a lecture on the occasion of his birth anniversary. So I think it is very generous on the part of our president to have accepted Thiru Marimuthu's suggestion that I be called to deliver this lecture. And while I'm afraid it may not be ideologically on par with what RK, as you called him, might have believed in, nevertheless, it is a very great honor to be asked to commemorate the first finance minister of India. Our president has already indicated that Thiru R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar was not Jawaharlal Nehru's choice. He was supported heavily by Sardar Patel, and Mahatma Gandhi, accepting that advice, insisted on Nehru that Sri R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar should be the first finance minister of India. And while there were many reasons, political and ideological, and even in terms of experience, that might have resulted in Sri Shanmugam Chettiar having some reservations about accepting this post, when he actually presented his budget, it had a very Nehruvian sentence in it, which gives me the courage to accept this invitation. In that very first budget speech, Sri Shetty said, and I quote, "If India, just risen from bondage, is to realize her destiny as the leader of Asia and take her place in the front rank of free nations, she would require all the disciplined effort of her sons." I think Nehru would have added, and her daughters. But at that time, it was not fashionable to mention the ladies. So he said of her sons, and put forward in the years the immense effort that is needed. I think that is a sentiment with which not only Jawaharlal Nehru, his prime minister, but also the entire country would have agreed. Back in 1947, there was an atmosphere of optimism, a belief that what had held us back was simply British rule, and that once we had got rid of British rule and run the country ourselves, it would not be long before India was not only the leader in Asia, but also in the front rank of the nations of the world. And while I think politically, Jawaharlal Nehru did succeed in putting us in the front rank of the nations of the world, on the economic front, there are two ways of looking at the achievement of Jawaharlal Nehru, along with his finance ministers, who included Shanmugam Chettiar, and immediately after him, it also included Sir John Mathai from Kerala, and much later, T.T. Krishnamachari from Tamil Nadu. And most recently, we've had Thiru P. Chidambaram repeatedly becoming the finance minister of India. So the contribution of Tamil Nadu to the growth of the Indian economy in terms of the finance ministers that Tamil Nadu had provided is very considerable, very considerable. And therefore, even as we pay our tribute to Sri R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar, I think it would be appropriate to also include a reference to TTK and to PC, as he's called by his colleagues and friends. At the same time, we have to recognize that Jawaharlal Nehru, in his economic philosophy, was generally at odds with his own finance ministers. What was the problem back in 1947? I would say they were twofold. Number one, 2/3 of our population was under the poverty line. Today, or this was true in fact,
Audio problem.
even in 1985, when I joined Rajiv Gandhi's office, the achievement, I would say, was that the ratio had been reversed. In the first 4 decades of our independence, we reversed the ratio of 2/3 under the poverty line to 2/3 above the poverty line. I think another major achievement was that whereas India under the British was a country famed, or shall we say disgraced, for the famines that repeatedly visited India during British rule, after we became independent, we have not had any instance of mass starvation. It may be true that there are individuals or stray cases of people dying of hunger, but whereas British rule began with a famine in 1770 that killed 1/3 of the people of Bengal and ended with the Bengal famine of 1943, in which at least 3 million people starved to death. In independent India, and we need to recognize this, in independent India, we have not had any instance of mass starvation. Also, I think we need to recognize that when India became independent, we didn't really know what was our GDP rate of growth. Subsequently, Angus Deaton, Alan Heston, and a Tamil economist called Shiva Subramanian have variously estimated what was India's rate of growth from 1914, which is the first year for which some reliable statistics are available, to 1947. And according to the lowest estimate, our rate of growth, average annual rate of growth, between 1914 and 1947 was 0.72% per annum. 0.72%. And the highest estimate, which has been given by Shiva Subramanian, was 1.22%. So when at the end of the first 5-year plan, which was between 1951 and 56, India's annual average growth rate had been raised to 3.5%. It was at least a 3 times increase in our historical rate of growth and perhaps a 5 times increase in our historical rates of growth. India has never achieved anything like that since those first few years. If we had succeeded in maintaining that rate of growth over the years between 1956 and 2020, we would today be growing at something like 20% a year. And where are we? We have succeeded, after economic reforms, in doubling that 3.5%. But I think, in fairness to Indira Gandhi, we should, and to Jawaharlal Nehru in a way, I think what we need to recognize that the decade of the 60s, which I'm very broadly defining as lasting from 1961, or more accurately 1962 to 1971, was marked by three major wars. The first was the armed liberation of Goa in 1961. The second was the really fierce fighting that broke out in the Northeast in November 1962 between China and India. And the outcome of that was that Pakistan was encouraged to invade India in 1965. And in 1971, we were obliged to go to the aid of the Mukti Bahini to stop the awful pogrom of East Pakistanis that the West Pakistanis were indulging in. So a whole decade, 10 years, were lost in fighting wars. And that had a very deleterious effect upon our rate of growth. So while a right-wing economist in Chicago University made himself immortal by describing our rate of growth in the 60s as the Hindu rate of growth, the fact of the matter is that it is only now that we have reverted in the Hindutva rate of growth to minus 10.3% in terms of the prediction of the IMF. So I think we need to take political factors into account before jumping to the conclusion that wrong economic policies give us low rates of growth, and right economic policies give us high rates of growth. There are other factors that are always operating. And what Jawaharlal Nehru felt, and this was true of the entire socialist wing of the Congress Party, whose leaders were Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose. And after the Karachi Congress in 1931, where this socialist majority succeeded in persuading the Congress Party that our highest priority after independence must be land reforms, and that our second, or this land reforms process, must be brought into the framework of socialism as it was understood then and as it had been interpreted for Indian conditions. And at least on the second, Mr. Shetty was not in agreement. In fact, he was articulating the contrary view of, let me confess straight away, of Mahatma Gandhi, of Sardar Patel, and several other members of the cabinet, that what we needed was a process of growth that would be initiated and carried forward by free enterprise, and that this free enterprise should be free to import anything they wanted to promote the growth process, that they should be free to encourage and invite foreign investment into India, and that we should be giving as much encouragement to exports as we could. And in the realities of that time, such a program appeared to Jawaharlal Nehru to not be a realistic program. First and foremost, he wanted land reforms. And it was those land reforms that really brought about such a spurt in the growth of agricultural production at a time when about 90% of India's population was in agriculture, not in commerce and not in industry. That we had this 3 times increase in our annual rate of growth, which might even have been a 5 times increase in our annual rate of growth. So before we start looking at the first decade of our independence through the spectacles of the 21st century, I think it is important, as any good historian will tell you, that you can only evaluate the past by looking at the realities of the past. There was a free market in India during British rule. There was no license, except during the war period. There was no license, there was no permits, there was no restriction on foreign exchange exports from India or imports of foreign exchange into India. There was no restriction on exports. There were no restrictions on imports. It was a classic example of a completely liberal economy and one that was globalized. Because don't forget, the Commonwealth was the single biggest world market since the Roman Empire. It stretched literally wherever the sun was shining. And therefore, while the British were boasting that the sun never sets on the British Empire, Indians involved in entrepreneurial activities also realized that the sun never sets on their commercial empires. So we'd had high experience of free enterprise, which involved both British investment and Indian investment. And incidentally, it also involved a segment of Marwadi investment in Bengal, which they had the money to do, but they did not have the managerial experience. And so a phenomenon that happily does not exist in our time, because it was abolished by Jawaharlal Nehru, the managing agency. The British were the managing agents, and the Indians were the one who were putting their investment in the control of British management agencies. And when we became independent, Jawaharlal Nehru insisted that we were a socialist economy. But it's interesting that he nationalized virtually nothing. Yes, he did have a major role to play in nationalizing rail transport and air transport. When I was a child and we would come to my village in Tanjore, we would travel in trains that were marked on their seats. It would say GIP. It was the Great Indian Peninsular Railway, which was privately owned. So the Indian railways were nationalized, and the person we stayed with when we came in as refugees from Pakistan, O.V. Allegation from Tamil Nadu, he was the Deputy Minister of Railways. And it was at that time that we had this nationalization of the railway network. And we also had the nationalization of air transport. But it was a strange kind of nationalization where J.R.D. Tata, who was the scion of the family that had started private sector civil aviation in India, was asked to become the chairman of the nationalized Air India. So there was no conflict between the private and the public sectors. There was a kind of cooperation in new circumstances. And apart from the railways and the roadways, the railways and the airways, the only other nationalization was of companies that were either British owned or run by British managing agents. So when I was posted in Iraq, which was an extreme socialist country, one of my major jobs was to explain to Iraqis who were skeptical that Richardson Crudas was not a private company. It was a nationalized public enterprise. That Barmer Lorry was not a British enterprise. It was a public sector Indian enterprise. And I can continue giving examples of Bird and Company and Andrew Yule. That was the situation. He did nationalize those companies which were being abandoned by the British. And he did nationalize our railways and he did nationalize our airways. But he left agriculture entirely in private hands. This meant that Indian socialism owed nothing to Soviet socialism. Because in the Soviet Union, it was the collectivization of agriculture that was the first sign of socialism in that country. And Nehru just rejected that. He also used to regularly visit the FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And in his annual lectures there, he would emphasize that we needed the private sector and that he was not going to interfere in Indian enterprise, provided they followed national goals and national objectives. But apart from that, there was little attempt at controlling them, except in terms of the fact that we went into a huge foreign exchange crisis. And foreign exchange was so little available that it was not possible to waste it. And therefore it had to be rationed. And because it had to be rationed, and because India's capital stock was so limited, that too had to be used sensibly. And he didn't want India's limited capital stock to be distributed in the same sector between several different companies, many of which would fail. There was this license permit Raj that got introduced in 1956. And it did become a major albatross on the neck of our economy. And it is this license permit Raj that has been heavily criticized in the last 3 decades after Dr. Manmohan Singh succeeded in not having socialism as the shibboleth of Indian economic policy. But if you start looking at the Nehru era through the spectacles of Dr. Manmohan Singh or any of his successors, I think that's an unfair way of looking at that time. And how unfair it is, I think is best illustrated by the figures of Sri R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar's first budget. Now, for fear that you may topple out of your chairs when I give you the figures, I request you to kindly hold on to your chairs. In Mr. Shanmugam Chettiar's first budget, the revenue of the government of India was estimated at 175 crore rupees. 175 crore. Just 175 crore. And his expenditure budgeted was 197 crore, leaving a budget deficit of the huge amount of 26 crore. There are many of you here, especially the more successful ones, who would simply have a draft, an overdraft of 26 crore rupee today. And the whole of India in 1947 had a deficit of only 26 crore. And that was because the economy was underdeveloped. And why was it underdeveloped? It was underdeveloped because the British policy of deindustrialization had removed the entire khadi and village industry sector from being a supplementary source of income for the poor of India. And that is why Mahatma Gandhi had made spinning, which was hand spinning, which was never done in urban India, but was done in every rural home, the symbol of our freedom movement. And the wearing of khadar. And I've got a khadar kurta on today, I'm proud to say. And that became the dress, the uniform of the freedom movement. Gandhiji was not asking for an economic policy that emptied our villages. He was asking for an economic policy that would bring prosperity to the villages by making the villages self-sufficient. And he had enough economic knowledge to explain that self-sufficiency was with regard to the goods that could be produced at the village level itself. He saw no reason for soap manufactured in factories. He saw no reason for cloth manufactured in mills. He saw no reason for processed foods that could not be processed in the village itself. But he recognized that apart from these basic necessities, which every village could, inshallah, provide for itself, there were other goods that would necessarily have to be traded. And when he talked of village self-sufficiency, he meant that the village should produce the surplus required to either exchange it for barter with something that another village was producing, or to convert it into cash and then buy it. And don't forget that barter was not unknown in 1947. A very small part of the Indian economy was monetized. And when I appeared for my BA examination about, 15, 16, 18 years after independence, barter was still about 20 or 30% of the exchange in the Indian economy. Today, we've all got monetized, and now we have Jan Dhan accounts, and we do all our trade virtually by monetary methods. But at that time, this was not a widespread practice. The banking network was confined really to industrialists who set up their own banks and used those banks to give credit to themselves, which they would never repay. And my father was a very well-known chartered accountant, Shankar Aiyar. And we have a memorial lecture for him on the 6th of November, which will be addressed by Dr. Arvind Subramaniam. And so if I'm allowed a commercial break at this point, I would like to request the president of the Tamil Chamber of Commerce to use his network also to advertise this lecture on India turning inwards and its causes and consequences by Dr. Arvind Subramaniam. A commercial break over.
Sure,
To get back, we were living in an economy which, according to the slogan, was really true. That industry meant Tata, Birla, Dalmia. And both Birla and Dalmia were clients of my father's. And they both went bust because of the hereditary system that applies in industry all over the world, that applies to capitalism as such, where a son succeeds a father for no better reason than that he is the son. And while this is deplored in politics, it is the accepted practice in industry, with the result that you very often get duffers who are running empires that were created by their brilliant forefathers. Anyhow, that is to move out of the realm of my lecture. My point is that the Indian economy had experienced total liberalization and total globalization during the period of British rule. And the outcome was that whereas India, before the British arrived, at the beginning of the 18th century, was responsible for about 1/4 of the world's manufactures, our deindustrialization was on such a scale that maybe 2, 3, 4% was India's contribution to world manufacture in 1947. And there had been no innovation in our agriculture because the landlord system did not benefit the tenant farmer or the landless farmer from any technical innovation. And landlords were too busy enjoying in their patueshtis all the money that came in from their being landlords, that they were not interested in technical innovation either. And that was why Indian agricultural productivity was as low as it was. And if it hadn't been for Nehru's land reforms, we would not have created the platform from which it became possible to launch the Green Revolution and make our country today self-sufficient in food with lots of products which require an export market because domestic demand or domestic effective demand has been more or less fulfilled for a number of products which through my lifetime were rare commodities in the market. So my plea to the members of the Tamil Nadu Chamber of Commerce is please do not look, I repeat it, please do not look at the period of Jawaharlal Nehru's stewardship with the spectacles of the 21st century. If Jawaharlal had not done what he did, we would not have been able to launch ourselves into higher rates of growth from the mid-1970s onwards. And it was because the foundations had been laid and war as a matter of policy had been virtually ended. We've had a very brief war over Kargil with the Pakistanis, which didn't have serious deleterious effects on our economy. And our recent clash with the Chinese in the Ladakh Aksai Chin area has also not seriously affected the economy. It's COVID and the lockdown policy that has been followed that is responsible for our current negative double-digit rate of growth. It's not economic policy, but political reality that has affected our growth prospects. But it is, I think, indubitably true that where in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, it seemed as if India was fulfilling Shanmugam Chettiar's objective of India being the leader in Asia. That's it, the leader of Asia. It was not true of China. The Chinese, through the awful period of let 1,000 flowers bloom or something, it said, they went through a process of agricultural reform which wrecked agriculture, and where no Indian has died of mass starvation since 1947, no one yet knows what were the number of Chinese who died in the period of the Great Leap Forward, which was from approximately 1957 till about 1962-63. At least 20 million Chinese died, and very possibly 50 million Chinese died. That is, more Chinese died of hunger in the first few years of Chinese independence or Chinese liberation than have ever died in India, even in British times, unless you go back to this 18th century. That was what had happened to China. And then to recover from that, Mao Zedong launched his Cultural Revolution. And my first visit to China was during the Cultural Revolution, from Hanoi, where I was posted, which was not mentioned by either our president or by Mrs. Marimuthu. But I traveled from Hanoi via China to Hong Kong and saw what was happening with my own eyes during the Cultural Revolution. So when we arrived in the mid-70s, we thought we were ahead of the Chinese. But a friend of mine, who was an economist and a journalist, and who then made a career with the World Bank, his name is Sarwar Latif, he wrote a piece for the London Economist, strictly speaking, the London Economist Intelligence Unit, in which he argued that far from being streets ahead of China, the Chinese have caught up with India and that they're more or less on the same plane. This was based on figures that he had collected up to 1976-77. And it was that paper which got him a job in Washington. So the Chinese were catching up with us, despite our excellent behavior, despite the Chinese having been at war much more than we had been. They had 14 disputes, territorial disputes with their neighbors, and were settling each one of them. And they had had these two major disruptions in their country and in their society. One, the Great Leap Forward, which turned out to be a great leap backward, and then the Cultural Revolution, which had nothing cultural about it. It was ghastly. And yet when they started recovering, and they had started recovering even in Mao's lifetime, when Deng Xiaoping took over and made his famous remark that what does it matter whether the cat is black or white so long as it catches mice, and launched themselves on a program of liberalization, it is very little known in India, although I was posted in Pakistan at that time and made big play with this before the Pakistan Management Association, that L.K. Jha, who was the senior civil servant operating our economic policy, had written a book which came out about 1979-80 called India's Economic Policy for the 80s, in which he recommended almost everything that Dr. Manmohan Singh was to do about a decade later. And I think, therefore, Dr. Manmohan Singh is to be congratulated and commended for saying, not once but repeatedly, that the reforms process actually began under Mrs. Gandhi in her second coming and was taken forward by Rajiv Gandhi in the latter half of the 1980s. And therefore, he had a base from which to launch his radical economic reforms in 1991, for which he is justly celebrated. So our process of economic growth has been to link yesterday with today and with the future. We do not believe in disruption as the way forward. Mahatma Gandhi was particular in saying that we should never have a revolution. We should reform. Now, we've followed the path of reform. The Chinese have followed the path of revolution. And today, the Chinese are so far ahead of us that I find it comical that there are colleagues of mine in the Foreign Service, colleagues of mine in politics, and friends of mine in industry who think that, oh, China is just a little ahead of us and our goal should be to catch up and overtake them. I think that is to live in a world of fantasy. Unless everything collapses around China's ears, they are the leader in Asia. That, whether you like it or not, and I think most of us do not like it, is the reality. Their GDP, their foreign exchange earnings, the ability, therefore, to spend it on giving real content to their foreign policy, it's all a reality which we must never forget. For if you underestimate the enemy and overestimate yourself, you're bound to make a mistake in external policy, which will turn out to be a disaster for the country. For example, we went into war almost blindfolded in 1962. And today, Northeast India would be a Chinese province, but for the fact that the Chinese unilaterally withdrew from the entire territory of what we call today Arunachal Pradesh. They even withdrew from Tawang. They did it unilaterally. So I think Nehru's vision of India and China working together to make an Asian century still remains a valid objective, even if reaching that goal has become virtually impossible in 2020 after what has happened in Ladakh. But I would hope that we will have the wisdom that Rajiv Gandhi demonstrated to work towards cooperation with China rather than confrontation as our mode of relationship with them. Then maybe we can balance expenditure on defense with expenditure on other aspects of economic development. And this brings me, have I got another 10 or 15 minutes, Mr. Nachia? Mr. President, would you be able to give me another 10 or 15 minutes?
Sure, sir.
Okay, thank you. And that brings me to an aspect of economics which is not being taken into consideration either by my government when it was in power, or by subsequent governments, or by private sector associations such as yours, which is Panchayati Raj. Panchayati Raj, as Mahatma Gandhi said, is the key to ensuring that economic growth becomes economic development. There is now no denying that high rates of growth in some of the years of the last 30 years has been very, very high, but it has also led to a widening of disparities in our country. It is not that the poor are becoming poorer, which was the formula used during the Great Depression of the 1930s. It is that the poor are becoming slightly less poor, while the rich are becoming unbelievably richer. Montek Singh Ahluwalia in his book called Breakthrough, has drawn attention to my cynical comment at that time when the Indian economy was doing very well. I said, you're growing the economy at 8%, but your poverty alleviation rate is 0.8%. What kind of development is this? He's drawn attention to that remark. I did make it. But it has to be admitted that what we have seen in the last 30 years, although the development process has been repeatedly disrupted, either for political reasons or for economic reasons, is that while our performance economically in the last 30 years is far superior to what our economic performance was in the previous 30 years, the distribution of income has got so skewed that those who are rich are phenomenally rich. The number of billionaires we have in our country, the number of places that they have risen. We have one industrialist in India, and I don't need to give you his name. He is about one of the richest people in the world. Isn't it obscene that one of the poorest countries in the world is boasting of one of the richest men in the world? In fact, if you took the billionaires that have been created in the last 30 years, their number runs perhaps to hundreds. Are poor. It's true that during the Congress period, that is the UPA period of 10 years from 2004 to 2014, raised 138 million people above the poverty line. But who defined the poverty line? The poverty line is a theoretical construct of the Planning Commission, and it is designed to keep our expenditure on the poor within the fiscal deficit. So we as politicians, certainly I, would wander my villages in Mailaduthai, and people would say, எனக்கு என்ன வன்முறை இல்லையா, எனக்கு வீடு இருக்கா, என் குழந்தைகளுடைய திருமையை பாருங்க, எவ்வளவு சாப்பிடுறோம் நம்ம, இதுதான் நான் சாப்பாடு. And they were all above the poverty line. They would show their Indira Awas Yojana housing, குடியிருப்பு திட்டம், and say, இதுவா வீடு. There was one person who expressed it even better. He tied his goats in his Indira Awas home and lived himself in a kudishe. So what do we mean by poverty is a very major question. And an economist whom I greatly respect, the late Dr. Arjun Sengupta, at a time when Planning Commission was claiming that there were 236 million poor Indians, said that there are actually 770 million poor Indians. And the Planning Commission never accepted this figure, but that was because they had defined poverty to suit themselves. So I think we ought to recognize that the pattern of growth which we have adopted is not a pattern of development. And that is because the poor, despite Panchayati Raj, have not been truly empowered. And unless the poor are empowered and they deliver to themselves in the last mile whatever are the goods and services that the central government or the state government is sending, they will not be 100% beneficiaries of that generosity. And furthermore, nobody wants to be a pichakar. Does anyone want to be a beggar? So if you make the large population of India recipients, but not participants, they will ever remain beggars. They will not be bringing their individual abilities to bear on the development of India. Mahatma Gandhi was the first to recognize that India's greatest strength is its people. He also was the first to recognize that the people of India have to become prosperous if the country is to be truly prosperous. And Jawaharlal Nehru understood this in his espousal of socialism and in the way in which he brought a form of Panchayati Raj into the country in 1959. And because he was such a strong leader, and the whole of the country, except Tamil Nadu, no, even Tamil Nadu, had voted for the Congress at that time, he was able to get his ideas spread throughout the country, with every state enacting Panchayat Raj laws. But when he died in 1964, Panchayati Raj, as started by him in 1959, came to an end. And it was only later, in Rajiv Gandhi's time, that there was a recognition that, look, there's something wrong in our system. We have the most brilliant students in the world becoming members of the IAS and the IFS. But while they have merit, has their performance got merit? And the answer was so clear. With poverty alleviation having made such a small dent, despite the increase in allocations, despite the attention being given in Delhi and in the state capitals to this question of removing poverty, the actual achievement was very little. And Rajiv Gandhi came to the conclusion that Gandhi was right, Nehru was right, unless we have people's participation, unless we have inclusive governance, we cannot have inclusive growth. Just remember that one sentence. What Panchayati Raj is about is inclusive governance for inclusive development. The people themselves make their own decisions. What, after all, is free enterprise? It means that members of the Tamil Chamber of Commerce should be left free to make their own choices. And that will give us prosperity. I accept that. But subject to the condition that the Tamil Chamber of Commerce also accept that we cannot have poverty alleviation without free enterprise at the lowest level. And free enterprise can only come if people are empowered. In the Tamil Chamber of Commerce, it is money that empowers you. In the villages of India, in the slums of India, before they can accumulate money, they have to be given the power to run their own lives, to make their own decisions with regard to Sarkari funds or Sarkari schemes. If they do not have that freedom, if they have to act at the behest of the Tahsildar and the block development officer and the DM and the minister, then there is no way in which they can become participants in their own development. And it was Mahatma Gandhi who in 1931, I'm repeating that because it's so important. It was Mahatma Gandhi who in 1931 was asked, what is your dream for a free India? And please listen to his answer. Mahatma Gandhi said, I shall work for an India. Now note, he'd been asked, what is your dream for an India? And implicitly he said, I refuse to dream. I only work. So he replied to this question, what is your dream for India? By saying, I shall work for an India in which the poorest Indian feels that it is his country. It is not Birla Tata's country. It's his country. Because, said Mahatma Gandhi, he has a voice, an effective voice, that was Gandhi's voice, in his own development. I'm sure all members of the chamber would agree that if they did not have a voice in running their own firms, the firms would do much worse than they are doing now. But the people of India, the poor people of India who do not have accumulated capital, they first need to be politically empowered before they can empower themselves economically. And the basic purpose of Panchayati Raj, and I'm not going into any of its technicalities, I'll do so very happily if the Tamil Chamber of Commerce invites me again to speak on Panchayati Raj. But to put it in a nutshell, the aim is to empower the poor to feel that the programs of economic development are their programs, that they have a role in conceiving these programs, that they have a role in implementing these programs, that the money for implementing them does not lie with the district magistrate or the collector, but with their own panchayat, and that whatever is spent by the panchayat is reported to the Gram Sabha. And the Gram Sabha is really the Parliament of India in every single village. That is the conception that Rajiv Gandhi brought forward. I'm afraid, in retrospect, he did not succeed in mobilizing his own party to have faith in this radical program. And that is why, while as a tribute to a dead man, they passed that Panchayati Raj Act, there has been so little cooperation from state governments in actually implementing what is said in the Constitution. Of course, they've done it in letter, but in spirit, they haven't. The exceptions are states like Kerala, and the communists were the biggest opponents of Rajiv Gandhi. But they've done it. And Rajiv always accepted that his inspiration was the government of Ramakrishna Hegde, which was anti-Congress, and particularly the efforts of Abdul Nazir Saab, who was the Minister of Panchayati Raj in Hegde's government, and created the first modern Panchayati Raj system in the country. So those two states have gone far ahead of others, but I'm happy to say that all states are catching up, and there are many states which are now beginning to rival the leaders. They're usually small states like Tripura and Sikkim, and there are other states which, in their own way, and that includes Tamil Nadu, are also implementing a form of Panchayati Raj. But until we empower the people to promote their own development, I am afraid the Gandhian vision of where India should go will remain unfulfilled. And if Rajiv Gandhi's ideas draft was approved by Parliament, it was largely because everyone saw, despite their opposition to what he had drafted, that this was the right path down which to go. And each state is doing it in its own way. And as a believer in cooperative federalism, I completely accept that. But I think the future lies in combining free enterprise for our capitalist class with free enterprise for our poor. And in both cases, it means giving them the possibility of choosing their own path and helping them out when they trip and supporting them in their own efforts, but relying on individual people's good sense for the development of the country rather than depending on either economists or administrators. I think economists and administrators should be put in their place by the people of India. I think the enterprising class, the industrial class, the chamber that you represent, have been freed of the albatross that Nehru had put around your necks. But we need your support to take the albatross that history has put around the necks of our poor, particularly our lower castes and our tribals. Thank you very much for this golden opportunity. I'm very, very grateful to President Shoranachya Rajashekar and his colleagues for having invited me to deliver this lecture. I hope I have met your expectations, and I conclude with a reference to the first Finance Minister of India, in whose memory we have gathered together. He was, in his own way, a truly great man, and I am honored that despite my ideological differences with him, you have chosen, in the true spirit of liberal democracy, to invite a Nehruvian socialist to deliver today's lecture. And my thanks again to Mr. and Mrs. Marimuthu for having made this possible. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving a diplomatic, being a diplomatic, your speech also diplomatic rather than political. Explaining the facts and figures and policies of our country regarding the inclusive growth and Panchayat Raj, etc. On behalf of our chamber, I assure that as you requested, the lecture of Arvind Subramaniam will be carried out in our PCC digest, which is going all around our country and also to abroad by soft copy. We will publish the same, and we assure. And being the virtual meeting, we can't able to provide the dinner. Usually our dinner meeting will be end with the dinner. Anyhow, when you have the opportunity to come for our state, Tamil Nadu, Chennai, particularly next visit, we will organize a dinner meeting. We promise. And few questions are there. I hope that you will answer for this 2-3 questions. As the first question from our side. For past 70, more than 70 years, 73, 74 years after independence, we are having planning commissions and Niti Aayog now, and all this ruled by several parties or several coalitions and everybody, as in a democratic way. We are always talking about the elevation of poverty, inclusive growth, but from the beginning to current days, we are having the disparity of haves and have-nots, and most of, as you spoke in your speech, the billionaires are there, but below the poverty line is increasing crores and crores every year. What is the solution to make above average of the people, the common people, to raise their poverty level above the poverty level, having the common growth? What is the solution? Your suggestion, sir.
Might I request you to please repeat that question?
Actually, sir, can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, yes.
After independence, 70 years, we are ruled by different parties, different coalitions till date.
Yes.
And having experts concerned about people welfare, all the politicians, irrespective of the party, everybody is talking about the inclusive growth, elevation of poverty, and all. In spite of all these planning commissions, Niti Aayog and everything, we are not able to reduce the gap between the haves and have-nots and raise the people above the poverty line with basic needs. One side we are having few billionaires, and the other side we have crores of people underprivileged. What is the solution for this to make people more prosperity and elevation of poverty?
Well, in a sense, I've tried through my speech to reflect on these questions. We have a democratic system and we have a very intelligent people. So there are bound to be different answers given, even when we accept the objective as being the same for everybody, which is the promotion of prosperity and the removal of poverty. But we each of us have our own separate approaches. Even within the Congress party, I have many different views to those of our leadership. So there is inevitably going to be a difference between my approach and Nirmala Sitharaman's approach, between Nirmala Sitharaman and Sitaram Yechuri. So that this is what is meant by a democracy. The alternative is China. And I would throw your question back to you. Would you rather be a rich Chinese or a poor Indian? You would not have any freedom of speech. This kind of a meeting could not be held in China. So there is a great deal of freedom which Indians take for granted is simply abolished by China. And because we have a democracy with a free debate taking place between Indians or groups of Indians, we have differences in approaching this issue. But I do believe that if structurally we were to empower the poor so that this conversation, to use Marxist language, does not take place only among the bourgeoisie, but also includes the opinion of the proletariat, then I think it will be a richer conversation. And that is why, structurally, I think the first step to poverty alleviation is effective Panchayati Raj. Mr. Rajiv Gandhi saw that point. I don't know that anybody else has championed that cause with as much enthusiasm and commitment as Rajiv Gandhi did. Yet we cannot produce a Rajiv Gandhi every day. And therefore, since he's shown us the way, I hope people in the country, including your own chamber, reflect on this particular issue as to what is the connection between the political structure of India and its economic performance. Why is it that we are so good at promoting billionaires and so poor at removing people from poverty? You put the question very well. I don't have an answer except to the extent of saying, please bring the people's voice into the debate and then we'll see where it goes.
Thank you, sir. Before a vote of thanks, a few, 2-3 questions are there. Aishwarya will ask on behalf of the participants, sir. Aishwarya, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, this is supposed to be an interactive session, the last part of the agenda of today's program. But then I've been going through these questions the participants have posting, and I see that you have brilliantly covered all these questions as you were delivering your speech. In spite of that, I would still like to post 1 or 2 questions, sir, with your permission.
Certainly.
We have a question from Mr. Karunagaran, and he asked, although we are the youngest population country, we find difficult in achieving skilled workforce. What do you think would be the factor of this?
I think the answer to that is that youth is not an asset. It is a characteristic. It comes from the calendar. Unless youth is educated, unless youth is given opportunities, unless the aspirations of youth is hooked to the development of the country, the demography, which ought to be our biggest advantage, is in danger of becoming our most dangerous liability. If you have hordes and hordes of poorly educated youngsters who have little prospects, I don't know how we're going to make our demography an advantage for our country. I'll give you the example of the civil services exam. Today, the first step of the civil services exam is a preliminary exam which consists of ticking the right box. And it is generally agreed that not more than 85% can be the right answer. The remaining 15% is a matter of luck, because different people may have, different experts might have different views on what is to be done. So what the UPSC does is, by this arbitrary process of examining, they exclude people. They're not attempting to include them. So you first get excluded because you're not a lucky person. And secondly, you get excluded because you don't have merit. But then the rest of it is a lottery. So if this is happening at the highest level of government service, you can imagine what is happening in the rest of the country. Without high growth, I'm afraid we will not be able to absorb the rural surplus into the modern economy. And as long as there are restrictions placed on agricultural productivity and agricultural output, agriculture will not be a lucrative profession. And with division and subdivision of land holdings, we are now down to an average of, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 0.65 hectares per farmer. Now, that's not a viable unit, but there's no way you can increase land. You can increase other assets, but you can't increase land. And therefore, I think we have not prepared ourselves to take advantage of this demographic asset that we have of lots and lots of young people. If we can use them properly, then maybe we can overtake China, because China is bound to slow down in 10 years from now, unless technical innovation takes place. And of course it will. But in order to enable us to move forward, what we need is a massive thrust on education, on ending malnutrition, on improving health services, in getting schools going, in getting colleges growing. And if you bring our entire school system, government school system, under the local authority, instead of the education minister determining transfers, it should be for the village to sack the headmaster who doesn't come. The village should be able to determine who should be the school teacher. Ideally, I would say, let the village decide what his salary should be. And that way, that's the only way we can ever get education going. And without education, without vocational skilling that Mahatma Gandhi insisted on, we are never going to get a labor force that is capable of remunerative production. And without remunerative production, how are you going to overtake anybody? We have languished at almost the same point, 130, on our Human Resource Development Index for the last 30 years. 30 years in which our rates of growth were so high that we thought that we would be able to sustain a growth in double digits. The only time the Indian economy has grown in double digits was in Rajiv Gandhi's last year, 1988-89, when the economy attained a growth rate of 10.67%. Has anybody ever given Rajiv the credit for achieving double-digit growth. He's the only one who's ever done it. But we don't give credit to him. We don't give credit to policies that have to evolve depending on circumstances. And we don't do the most important thing, which is human resource development and the deepening of our democracy to put us in a position where we can leapfrog. In the old days, Rajiv used to say leapfrog into the 21st century. Now I say to leapfrog into the 22nd century. Thank you. And sorry for being so pessimistic.
Thank you, sir. Sir, may I ask one more question? Only one. So this is from Mr. Anbumuri. He asked, Panchayat Raj is basically empowering the local communities to govern themselves and contribute for economic growth. What, in your vision, will be the aspiration for private sector in this empowerment process?
Well, if there is collective bargaining through the panchayats, then maybe we can allow the private sector to come in. But if there is a big industrial organization and the people are atomized, each individual farmer is being contacted by somebody who wants to get into corporate farming, then the bargaining power is completely unequal. That is why Marx talked of the immiserization of the proletariat, because in his day there were no trade unions. And it was trade unionism more than anything else which made capitalism humane and acceptable. And today, and India was one of the first beneficiaries of trade unionism. The Trade Union Act that we have of 1921 is one of the oldest pieces of labor legislation anywhere in the world. And what are we doing now? We are dismantling it in order to make all organized labor into unorganized labor. And who will benefit from that? Those who are already rich. And who will suffer from that? Those who are barely out of poverty. So I'm afraid this has to be seen as a method. And for that method, I say, empower the people and then let them confront whoever comes before them. It'll be a challenge and they'll be able to overcome it. That is essentially what socialism in India means, which is why I am an unreconstructed socialist and say so with pride. And my hero is Jawaharlal Nehru.
Thank you, sir. I request the Chamber's Secretary, Mr. P. Ravikumar David, to propose the vote of thanks. Ravikumar sir, please unmute yourself. Yes, sir.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir, we do.
Sorry. On behalf of the Tamil Chamber of Commerce, particularly on behalf of our President, Mr. Chodanachia Rajsekhar, the office bearers and the executives, it is my pleasant duty to propose the vote of thanks. I sincerely thank Mr. Shankar Aiyar, 3 times Member of Parliament to the Lok Sabha from Tamil Nadu and former Minister of Development of Northeastern Region and former Minister of Panchayat Raj, Sports, Youth Welfare, Petroleum, for having accepted our request and delivered the first ever Dr. R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar Memorial Lecture on the topic Indian Economy, Past, Present and Future. His special address was very useful, informative, and his extempore fluent address was really a special address because it expressed his rich experience and deep knowledge in the administration, in the foreign affairs, economy, and various other fields. It was really a very good one, and we thank you, sir, for sparing your time and even requesting for additional time and for having spoken for more than an hour and giving us a lot of inputs, which is duly recorded and will be used at the appropriate time for the benefit of our members. Thank you, sir. Then,
Thank you.
Tamil Chamber of Commerce, shortly called TCC, has completed 75 years last year. In the year 1944, TCC was born due to the efforts of many visionaries. And it was Dr. R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar who was very much instrumental in the formation of the TCC. And he was the first finance minister of independent India. And he was also the first finance minister from the state of Tamil Nadu, earlier known as Madras. So it was thought fit to organize this memorial lecture in his name from this year onwards. So it is appropriately started this lecture on his 120th birthday. Apart from the visionaries who started the TCC, there had been 18 presidents. Just I would like to take a few minutes. I think 7:30 only the IPL match starts, so I will complete before that. I'm sure you'll all hear some additional information. There were 18 presidents who, during the last 75 years, who led the TCC, and during the last 3 decades, there were notable persons like Mr. R.M. Dave, Mr. Nalli Kuppusamy Chetty, who is now the patron of Nalli Kuppusamy Chetty is the patron of the TCC, and the Nalli silk is a well-known brand, and they are now going to open an outlet in London. And Mr. C. Rachansan Shuaska in 1994 to 96 was the president, and he also rendered yeoman service. Mr. S. Sandana, who is the head of the Sattva Group, was the president during 1996 to 2007, and recently they opened a CFS in Bangalore. From 2007 onwards, Mr. Cholanachya Rajasekhar is the president, and there had been a lot of developments taking place under his leadership. We have a well-constituted executive committee consisting of vice presidents, and some of our vice presidents are participating in this program, particularly Mr. Chandrasekhar, Mr. Jaykumar, and the honorary secretary, honorary treasurer, and strong executive committee, which extend their cooperation and support to the TCC. And the meetings are held regularly every month, and the viewers will be astonished to know that one meeting was held on board the ship, and the 75th year executive committee meeting was held in Malaysia. And the 2019 Platinum Jubilee celebrations was held in a fitting manner, and the special EC meeting was held in Malaysia, as I have told you. The Chambers Day was introduced during the regime of Mr. Cholanachya Rajasekhar. 9th October is the day the chamber was founded, and that is being celebrated from this year onwards, like we are now started the Dr. R.K. Shanmugam Chettiar Memorial Lecture from this year. And we also organize members get together and breakfast meetings. The breakfast meetings have the theme, Sky is the Limit, Vaname Yellai, அந்த தலைப்புடன் பல துறைகளிலிருந்து பலரும் பங்கு பெறும் ஒரு நிகழ்வாக அது நடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது. அதே போல் similarly we have the TCC Digest, which our president told, which is a very popular one. This is the copy of our TCC Digest, which is brought out regularly and which is much awaited. People, in fact, in the government service and in the diplomatic side and abroad, they wait for this digest. And last year we introduced the TCC calendar with the images and pictures of various important places throughout India and almost all the states, covering all the states. And now during this COVID-19 pandemic, we are having visual meetings. TCC promotes the interest of trade and industry, and Mr. Cholanachya Rajasekhar is also the chairman of the consultative committee of the city chambers of commerce, comprising of Andhra Chamber of Commerce, Hindustan Chamber of Commerce, National Chamber of Commerce and the Hindustan Chamber of Commerce and Madras Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Southern India Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And special assistance and support is in export and import matters is extended to the members through the various programs and handling of issues with the government and the state and central governments. At this juncture, I extend an open invitation to the non-members who are viewing this program to become the members of the TCC to enhance their business interests. Before I conclude, I thank the President, Vice President, Honorary Treasurer, EC members for the cooperation and support. Special thanks to the TCC Secretariat, particularly Mr. Karnagaran, the Executive Secretary. I'll be failing in my duty if I do not thank Mrs. Vasumati Marimuthu for doing the invocation and the introduction, and Mr. Marimuthu for coordinating the